Welcome to Mortis Terrors. Story 1. The Grave That Moves.
The first time I noticed the grave had moved, I blamed myself. I had worked at Blackwood Cemetery for almost 11 years, and I knew every inch of that place. I knew which gates squeaked in cold weather, which trees dropped branches after a storm, which sections flooded after heavy rain. I could have walked through the cemetery blindfolded and still known where I was. That was why the headstone bothered me. It stood near the oldest section, where the graves were so old that many of the names had been erased by rain and time. The stone belonged to a man named Elias Vane. At least, that was what I could still make out beneath the moss. One Monday morning, I noticed that the stone seemed closer to the cemetery path, only by a few inches. I stared at it for several minutes. I remember telling myself that the ground had shifted. That explanation lasted until Tuesday. The stone had moved again. I measured the distance from the edge of the path to the base of the headstone. I wrote the measurement in my maintenance notebook, 38 inches. The next morning, it was 34. I stopped making excuses. I brought out a can of bright orange marking paint and sprayed a thick line around the base of the stone. I painted another line across the ground directly in front of it. Then I stood there for a while, staring at the grave. I remember whispering, "Don't move." I felt ridiculous immediately afterward, but I meant it. That night, I checked the cemetery security cameras. Blackwood had cameras covering every entrance and the main paths. The camera closest to Elias Vane's grave had a clear view of the stone. I rewound the footage from midnight until sunrise. Nothing. The stone didn't move. No animals crossed the frame. No branches fell. No person entered the cemetery. At 2:17 in the morning, the camera briefly flickered. For less than a second, the image became static. When the picture returned, the grave looked exactly the same. I watched the footage again, then again. Nothing. The next morning, I walked straight to the grave. The orange paint was still there. The stone was not. It had moved nearly 6 inches toward the cemetery exit. I stood there so long that the cold morning air began to hurt my lungs. I checked the ground. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no disturbed grass, nothing. The stone had simply moved. I began searching the cemetery records that afternoon. The name, Elias Vane, appeared in a burial ledger from 1897. According to the entry, the burial had taken place on October 14. I found the death certificate a few minutes later. The date of death was October 11. That seemed normal. Then I looked at the signature. The certificate had been signed on October 17, 3 days after the burial. I stared at that date until my eyes began to ache. I checked the document again. The 17th of October, 1897. I searched for anything else connected to Elias Vane. I found a handwritten note buried inside an old ledger. The ink had faded almost completely, but I could still read enough. I wrote the words down because I didn't trust myself to remember them. Buried before confirmation of death. That sentence made my stomach tighten. I kept searching. Underneath it, someone had written another line. "Do not disturb the grave." I should have stopped there. Instead, I went back to the cemetery. It was nearly dark. I stood beside Elias Vane's grave and looked at the orange paint surrounding the stone. The distance between the paint and the stone was obvious now. The stone had moved again, toward the exit. I went home that night and barely slept. At 3:12 in the morning, I woke up convinced I had heard something. A scraping sound. Slow, heavy, like stone dragging across concrete. I listened. Nothing. Then I heard it again. Scrap. I sat upright. The sound seemed to come from outside my bedroom window. I didn't move. Another scrape. Then silence. I eventually convinced myself that I had dreamed it. At sunrise, I drove back to Blackwood. I didn't even bother parking near the office. I walked directly to Elias Vane's grave. The stone had moved almost 3 feet. I knew because the orange paint was still visible on the ground behind it. The grave itself hadn't moved. Only the headstone had. That was somehow worse. I called the cemetery owner and told him everything. He laughed at first. Then I sent him photographs. He stopped laughing. He told me to leave the grave alone. I asked him why. He wouldn't answer. Instead, he told me something I still wish I had never heard. He said the cemetery had tried moving the stone once before. In 1954, according to an old maintenance report, workers had relocated it several yards away from the original grave. The next morning, the stone was back, exactly where it had started, except for one detail. It was facing the opposite direction. I went back to the cemetery that afternoon. The stone was closer to the exit again. I decided to stay overnight. I brought a chair, a flashlight, my phone, and a camera. At midnight, I sat 30 feet from the grave. Nothing happened. 1 o'clock, nothing. 2, nothing. Then, at 2:17, my camera screen went black. Not the cemetery. The camera. Every light on the device disappeared. I looked up. The cemetery was completely silent. Then I heard the scraping. I saw the headstone move. Not quickly. Not violently. It tilted forward slightly. Then it slid. A few inches. It stopped. Then it moved again. I couldn't breathe. The stone was moving toward me. I wanted to run. I couldn't. I watched it drag itself across the earth, leaving a deep groove behind it. Then I heard something beneath the ground. 3 knocks. I froze. 3 slow knocks. From underneath the grave. Knock, knock, knock. The headstone stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the ground beside the grave shifted, just slightly, like something underneath it had turned over. I ran. I don't remember reaching the gate. I don't remember getting into my truck. I only remember looking into the rearview mirror as I drove away. The cemetery gate was closing behind me. I hadn't touched it. The next morning, I returned with the owner. The grave was exactly where it had always been. The headstone was gone. We searched the cemetery. Nothing. Then we checked the security footage. There was only one strange moment. At 2:17 in the morning, the camera showed the grave. The headstone was there. Then the image flickered. When it returned, the headstone was gone. But something else had appeared. A dark shape stood beside the grave. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't make out clothing. I could only see the silhouette. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera. We froze the image. The owner stared at the screen. Then I noticed something in the background. The cemetery gate. It was open, and beyond it, on the road outside the cemetery, stood the missing headstone. I knew that was impossible. There was no way anyone could have moved it without leaving tracks, but the footage showed it clearly. The stone was standing beside the road, facing the cemetery. I quit that same day. I never went back. 3 weeks later, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the old death certificate. I don't know how anyone could have taken it from the cemetery archives. I don't know why it was sent to me. But something had been added. A new date had been written beneath the original signature. The 13th of August, 2026. Today's date. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I heard 3 knocks against my front door. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't answer. The knocking stopped. A few seconds later, I heard something scrape across the concrete outside. Slowly, heavily, I looked through the window. I couldn't see anyone, but I could see the sidewalk, and I could see a long, fresh groove carved through the dirt. It started at the street, and it ended directly beneath my front door. I haven't opened the door. I haven't slept. And every morning since then, I have found another inch of orange paint appearing across my driveway, moving closer, closer, closer. Tonight, I finally understand what the grave was doing. It wasn't trying to leave the cemetery. It was trying to find me. And whatever was buried in 1897, I don't think it was the thing that died. I think it was the thing that was waiting to get out.
Story 2. The Woman at the Wrong Grave.
I started visiting my father's grave every Sunday after he died. At first, I went because I couldn't accept that I would never hear his voice again. Later, I went because the cemetery became the only place where I still felt close to him. The cemetery was old. Most of the stones were cracked, leaning, or covered in moss. Tall trees surrounded the grounds, and their branches seemed to knot together above the graves, blocking most of the daylight. There was one grave I began noticing after several weeks. It belonged to an elderly woman who always knelt beside the same headstone. I never saw her arrive. I never saw her leave. Every time I visited, she was there. She wore a long gray coat, even when the weather was warm, and a black scarf wrapped tightly around her head. Her hands were usually pressed against the earth, and she talked, quietly, always to the ground. The first few times, I assumed she was praying. Then I listened. She wasn't praying. She was having a conversation. I could never hear the words clearly, but I could hear the rhythm of her voice. Sometimes she laughed softly. Sometimes she sounded angry. Once, I heard her whisper, "Please don't make me wait again." That sentence stayed with me. I began arriving earlier on Sundays just to see if she was already there. She always was. One afternoon, I watched her lean toward the grave and place her ear against the dirt. Then she smiled. I remember feeling a cold sensation move through my stomach. I told myself I had misunderstood what I saw. I told myself grief could make people behave strangely. Then, one Sunday evening, I heard something I couldn't explain. I had stayed late because I didn't want to leave my father's grave. The cemetery was almost completely dark. I stood beside my father's headstone when I heard the woman speaking. "Tell me again." I looked toward her. She was kneeling beside the grave. "I want to hear it again." Then she became silent. I heard a faint sound, a knock, 3 slow taps. From beneath the ground, I froze. The woman smiled. "Good," she whispered. I should have left. Instead, I walked toward her. With every step, the cemetery seemed to become colder. When I reached her, she looked up at me. Her face was pale and deeply wrinkled. I asked her who she was visiting. She stared at me with genuine confusion. Then she pointed at the headstone beneath her hands. "My son," she said. "He was buried here yesterday." I looked down. I knew the name on the stone. I had passed it dozens of times. The date of death was carved beneath the name. I calculated the years in my head. 63. The man beneath that stone had been dead for more than 60 years. I told her that. She simply stared at me. "No," she whispered. I pointed toward the date. She looked down. For the first time, she seemed frightened. "That isn't his date." I asked what she meant. She touched the stone with trembling fingers. "My son was buried here yesterday." Then she looked at me. "Where is the new stone?" I didn't understand. She suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her hand was freezing. "Did you see them?" I asked. "Who?" "The men." I felt my pulse pounding beneath her fingers. She leaned closer. "They came after midnight." I asked what they did. Her eyes moved toward the grave. "They opened it." I looked at the earth. There were no signs that the grave had been disturbed. Then she whispered something that made my blood turn cold. "They put him back." I asked what she meant. She shook her head. "He wasn't supposed to wake up." A sound came from beneath us. One knock. I stopped breathing. The woman smiled again. Then another knock. This time, I heard it clearly. 3 taps. Exactly as before. I pulled my wrist away. The woman looked at the grave. "He knows you're here." I backed away. She called my name. I never told her my name. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. That night, I barely slept. At around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 taps. I sat upright. My bedroom was completely dark. 3 more taps. I turned toward my bedroom door. Nothing. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from beneath my bed. I refused to look. I stayed awake until sunrise. The following morning, I called the cemetery office. I asked about the woman. The person on the phone became strangely quiet. Then I described the grave. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, I was told something I wish I had never heard. That grave had been opened once before. In 1963, the records showed that a young man had been buried there, but the records also contained a handwritten note. I asked what it said. The person reading the record hesitated. Then the words came through the phone. "Grave reopened after unexplained knocking was reported." I hung up. I never returned to the cemetery. Not until my father appeared in my dreams. He was standing beside his grave. He looked exactly as I remembered him, but he wasn't alone. The old woman stood beside him. She pointed toward the ground. My father looked at me. Then he said something I could still hear when I woke. "Don't let her find the right grave." I woke before dawn. For several minutes, I lay completely still. Then I heard 3 knocks. This time, they came from inside my bedroom wall. I moved out of that house the same day. I never learned what happened to the woman. I never learned who she believed was buried beneath that stone. But 6 months later, I received a photograph in the mail. There was no return address. The photograph showed my father's grave. Someone had taken it at night. The cemetery was empty, except for one figure kneeling beside my father's headstone. The old woman, and beneath the photograph, written in shaky handwriting, were 6 words. "He says you visit too often." I burned the photograph. I burned the envelope. I even burned the clothes I had been wearing when I first met her. But last night, I heard the knocking again. 3 slow taps. This time, it came from beneath my bedroom floor. Then I heard my father's voice, very softly, very clearly, and I heard him say my name. Then the old woman whispered from somewhere underneath me, "Finally."
Story 3. The 3:17 a.m. bell.
I used to think the dead were quiet. I don't believe that anymore. For 6 weeks, I had been receiving reports about a bell ringing at exactly 3:17 every morning near an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of Black Hollow. The strange part wasn't the time. The strange part was that there was no bell. The church that once stood beside the cemetery had been demolished 43 years earlier. I verified that myself. I found photographs of the demolition, newspaper articles, even the original property records. The bell tower had been torn down with the rest of the building. There was nothing left. And yet, every morning at 3:17, people heard it. I decided to spend one night there. I arrived just before midnight with 3 audio recorders, 2 cameras, a thermal imaging device, and enough batteries to last until sunrise. I parked outside the cemetery gates and walked through the rusted entrance. I remember the cold. It wasn't ordinary nighttime cold. It felt as though the temperature dropped with every step I took toward the cemetery. By 1 a.m., I had set up my equipment beside an old stone mausoleum. By 2:30, nothing had happened. At 3, I began recording continuously. At 3:10, I heard something behind me. A soft scrape. I turned around. Nothing. I checked the camera. Nothing. I told myself it was a branch moving against a tombstone. At 3:16, I heard a faint metallic vibration in the distance. My heart started pounding. I looked toward the far end of the cemetery. There was a church-shaped shadow between the trees. I couldn't explain it. There was no building there when I arrived. I watched it for several seconds. Then the clock on my recorder changed to 3:17. The bell rang. Boom. The sound was enormous. It didn't seem to come from one direction. It seemed to come from underneath me. The ground vibrated. Birds exploded from the trees. I felt the stone beneath my hand tremble. Then the bell rang again. Boom. I started laughing. Not because anything was funny. I was terrified. And sometimes fear makes the body do things the mind doesn't understand. I whispered, "There's no church." The 3rd strike came. Boom. Then I heard the voices. At first, I thought they were distant people talking. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all whispering at once. I couldn't understand the words. I grabbed my recorder and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat there shaking, staring at the cemetery gates. The bell stopped. The voices stopped. Everything became silent. I drove home before sunrise. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Instead, I spent the next afternoon cleaning the recordings. The first audio file was useless. The bell had completely overloaded the microphone. The second was clearer. The third contained something that made me stop breathing. Beneath the bell, buried under the static, were the whispers. I increased the volume. I filtered the background noise. I slowed the recording. The voices became clearer. I could hear them now. They were repeating the same phrase, over and over. I wrote down what I heard. Daniel Mercer. My full name. I stared at the screen. Then I played it again. Daniel Mercer. Again. Daniel Mercer. I checked the equipment. I checked the recording date. I checked every possibility I could think of. There was no way anyone could have known I was going to be there. I had never publicly announced the investigation. I hadn't told the residents. I hadn't even told my closest friends. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. That night, I didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., I sat in my living room with every light on. At 3:16, I heard something outside. A faint, metallic vibration. My blood went cold. At 3:17, the bell rang. Boom. I dropped my phone. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from my recording equipment. The audio file on my laptop had started playing by itself. I watched the progress bar move. Then the voices began. Daniel Mercer. I unplugged the laptop. The voices continued. Daniel Mercer. I pulled the power cable from the wall. The screen went black. The voices continued. They were no longer coming from the laptop. They were coming from the hallway. I couldn't move. I heard dozens of whispers gathering outside my living room. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, bare feet against the wooden floor. One step, then another. I stared toward the darkness. Something stopped just beyond the doorway. I could hear breathing. Then a woman's voice whispered my name. Not from the hallway, from directly behind me. I turned. Nobody was there. But my bedroom door, which I knew I had closed, was now standing open. Inside the room, my old digital clock displayed one number, 3:17. The bell rang again, except this time, I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it inside my skull. The room disappeared. For 1 second, I was back in the cemetery. I was standing beside the mausoleum. The fog surrounded me. The ruined church stood at the end of the cemetery, and beneath its broken bell tower, dozens of people were standing in a circle. They were facing me. Every one of them had their mouths sewn shut. Then one woman raised her hand. She pointed behind me. I slowly turned. There was a grave directly beneath my feet. The stone was new. My name was carved into it. Daniel Mercer. Beneath my name was a date. The date was tomorrow. I woke up screaming. It was morning. Sunlight filled my bedroom. For several minutes, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Then I noticed the mud on my feet. I hadn't left the house. At least, I didn't remember leaving. I checked my security camera. At 3:17 a.m., I watched myself walk out of my front door. I walked barefoot into the darkness. I never came back on camera. The recording ended with me standing at the end of the street. Then the image distorted. Behind me, something appeared. A church bell, hanging in the air where no building existed. I haven't gone back to Black Hollow. I haven't investigated another cemetery. I haven't recorded another paranormal case. But every morning, at exactly 3:17, I wake up. And every morning, I hear the bell. 3 strikes. Always 3. The last time it happened, I heard something underneath the final ring. A whisper. My own voice. It said, "You forgot to dig." I don't know what that means, but tonight, I found dirt underneath my fingernails. And there is a shovel leaning against my bedroom wall. I don't own a shovel.
Story 4. The Empty Grave.
I have worked in cemeteries for 27 years, and I used to believe there was nothing left in the ground that could frighten me. I was wrong. I found the grave on a Tuesday morning in January. I remember the date because I wrote it down immediately afterward, although I have never been able to explain why. January 14th. The temperature had fallen below freezing overnight, and a thin crust of ice covered the grass. My boots cracked through it with every step as I made my usual inspection of the older section of the cemetery. That was when I noticed the depression. At first, I thought the ground had settled naturally. Old graves sometimes collapse after decades, especially after heavy rain. But this depression was different. The earth had folded inward. The center of the grave had sunk nearly 4 feet, leaving a dark, jagged hole surrounded by broken soil. I stood at the edge and stared down into it. I could smell wet earth. Then I noticed something else. There were footprints, bare footprints. They began at the bottom of the collapsed grave. I remember staring at them for several seconds before my mind accepted what my eyes were seeing. The prints crossed the muddy bottom, climbed the side of the grave, and continued through the cemetery. There were 12 of them. 6 left, 6 right. Small footprints, human footprints, bare footprints. I looked down at my own boots, then back at the prints. The temperature was 21 degrees. Nobody could have walked barefoot through that cemetery without leaving more than footprints behind. I called my supervisor. By noon, the grave had been roped off. I helped clear the surrounding dirt, expecting to find a damaged coffin underneath. I had seen old coffins collapse before. Sometimes all that remained was a wooden outline, a few rusted nails, and fragments of bone. But when I reached the bottom, I found nothing. No coffin, no wood, no bones, nothing. I stood inside that hole with a shovel in my hands and felt the cold rising through my boots. The grave was empty. I remember saying, "There should be something here." My supervisor said the same thing. We checked the cemetery records. The grave belonged to a woman named Evelyn Marrow. The records stated that Evelyn had died in 1924. I found that strangely unsettling, although I couldn't explain why. I had expected an ordinary name, an ordinary death, an ordinary grave. Instead, I had an empty grave belonging to someone who had supposedly been dead for more than a century. The footprints became the focus of the investigation. I was asked to help follow them. I wish I hadn't. The footprints continued toward the cemetery gate. Every print was perfectly formed. 5 toes, a narrow heel, a shallow indentation where the weight had pressed into the frozen mud. The strangest part was the temperature. The ground around the footprints was frozen solid. The mud inside the footprints wasn't. It was wet, warm, almost. I crouched beside one and touched the edge with my glove. The mud steamed. I pulled my hand away. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I simply kept walking. The trail ended at the cemetery gate. There were no footprints outside. None. It was as if whatever had walked out had simply disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 12 footprints. 6 left, 6 right. Then, sometime after 2 in the morning, I heard something outside my bedroom window. 3 soft knocks. I froze. 3 more. I got out of bed and looked through the curtains. There was nobody there. But beneath my window, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Bare footprints. Fresh footprints. I didn't leave my house for the rest of the night. The next morning, I was told the investigation had uncovered something strange in the cemetery archives. A photograph. The photograph had been taken in 1924. It showed Evelyn Marrow standing beside a family cemetery. I stared at the image for a long time. The face was clear. The clothing was clear. The expression was clear. Then I noticed the date written on the back. October 1924. The same year the grave record said Evelyn had died. I thought the photograph had to be wrong. Then another photograph was found. And another. The dates changed. 1929, 1930, 1931, 1932. Each photograph showed the same woman, the same face, the same clothing, the same expression, standing outside the cemetery, always watching the camera, always looking exactly the same age. I asked how that was possible. Nobody answered. Then, I noticed something in the final photograph. It had been taken in 1968. The cemetery gate was visible in the background, and standing beside it was Evelyn, barefoot, wearing the same dark dress from the 1924 photograph. I recognized the dress immediately. It matched the description in the original burial record. I couldn't breathe. Then I noticed the grave behind her. The same grave I had discovered. The same stone. The same iron fence. Only one detail was different. In the photograph, the grave was open. I looked closer. At the bottom of the grave stood a man. I couldn't see the man's face, but I could see the boots. My boots. The exact boots I had been wearing when I climbed into the empty grave. I stopped looking at the photograph. I told myself it was impossible. I told myself photographs could be altered. I told myself exhaustion had destroyed my judgment. Then I saw the final detail. Someone had written a date beneath the photograph. The 14th of January, 2026. My hands began shaking. That was the day I had discovered the grave. The photograph had been taken decades before I was born, yet the date beneath it was the date I found the empty grave. I went back to the cemetery that evening. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe I wanted to see the grave one last time. The hole had been covered. The ropes were still around it. I stood outside the fence and stared into the darkness. Then I heard footsteps behind me, bare feet pressing into frozen ground. One step, then another. I turned around. Nothing. I looked down. Fresh footprints appeared in the frost. They were coming toward me. I backed away. The footprints stopped directly in front of my boots. Then I heard a woman's voice behind the cemetery gate. I couldn't see anyone, but I heard the words clearly. "I've been waiting for you." I ran. I never returned to that cemetery. I quit my job the next morning. I threw away my boots. I destroyed every photograph I had taken, but one photograph survived. I found it beneath my front door 3 days later. I don't know who left it there. The photograph showed the cemetery gate. Evelyn stood beside it. She was still wearing the dark dress. She was still barefoot, and she was still looking directly at the camera. Only this time, I was standing beside her. I was wearing no shoes. And behind us, the grave was open. I don't know how long I had been standing there. I don't know where the photograph was taken. But I know one thing. The grave was no longer empty. Something was standing inside it. And whatever it was, I was looking directly at it.